I was standing in the checkout line at our neighborhood grocery store when my daughter-in-law smiled at the cashier and said, "Don't bother talking to her. She's just the maid." My own son chuckled. My 13-year-old grandson laughed right along with him. They thought the story ended there. They had no idea they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I'm Margaret Whitaker, 68 years old, and until that Saturday afternoon, I believed there was still a line my family would never cross. I had spent decades convincing myself that every cold comment, every forgotten invitation, every awkward silence at family dinners could be explained away by stress, misunderstandings, or busy schedules. That afternoon proved I had been lying to myself for years. It started like any ordinary Saturday. The sky over Columbus, Ohio, was bright with the kind of crisp autumn sunshine that made even simple errands feel pleasant. The air carried the scent of fallen maple leaves, and people pushed shopping carts through the parking lot with pumpkins, apple cider, and football snacks piled high. Brianna had suggested we all shop together before Sunday dinner. She claimed it would be easier if we picked up everything in one trip. I agreed because saying yes had become a habit long before I realized how often my kindness was mistaken for weakness. Ethan drove while Brianna sat in the front passenger seat scrolling through her phone. My grandson Caleb wore headphones around his neck, laughing at videos I couldn't hear. I sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window at neighborhoods I had watched grow over the last 40 years. Every familiar street carried memories. The bakery where Ethan begged for cinnamon rolls before Little League games. The hardware store where my late husband Daniel spent Saturday mornings looking at tools he probably didn't need. The little diner where we celebrated every birthday, every promotion, every anniversary. Sometimes memories feel warm. Other times they remind you how much has quietly disappeared. We entered the grocery store together, and I reached for a shopping cart out of habit. Brianna immediately waved her hand. "We'll take the big cart," she said. "Margaret, you can push it." Her tone wasn't openly rude. It was something worse. It was casual, as though assigning me small tasks had become the most natural thing in the world. I simply nodded. Arguing over little things never seemed worth it. Besides, I told myself, families help one another. We spent nearly an hour walking through wide aisles filled with colorful produce, fresh bread, and shelves stocked for the weekend. Brianna selected expensive imported cheeses, organic meats, and gourmet desserts without looking at prices. Ethan tossed craft beverages into the cart while discussing work emails. Caleb filled the basket with frozen pizza, chips, and enough candy to satisfy an entire baseball team. Every so often someone handed me another item to organize or asked me to run back 3 aisles because they had forgotten something. Not once did anyone ask whether there was anything I wanted. Still, I smiled whenever Caleb looked my way. He had my late husband's blue eyes, and every glimpse of them softened my heart. By the time we reached the checkout lanes, the cart was overflowing. A young cashier with freckles and a cheerful smile looked up as we approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said warmly, making eye contact with me. "Would you like me to help unload your cart?" Before I could answer, Brianna laughed softly and leaned toward the young woman. "Oh, don't worry about her," she said with effortless confidence. "She's just the maid. Don't waste your time talking to her." For a second, everything became strangely quiet. The beeping scanners, the conversations in nearby lines, even the shopping carts rolling across the polished floor seemed to disappear. The cashier's smile froze. She looked at me, then back at Brianna, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Ethan let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they don't want to challenge someone standing beside them. Caleb grinned and shrugged as if it were the funniest joke he had heard all week. My fingers tightened around the shopping cart handle. I could have corrected her immediately. I could have reminded everyone in that checkout lane exactly who I was. Instead, I simply looked at Brianna. Her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a satisfied smile. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't pretending. She genuinely enjoyed watching strangers believe I was beneath her. That realization hurt more than the words themselves. The young cashier quietly whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am," barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. I gave her a small smile and nodded. "It's all right," I answered softly. Then I released the shopping cart, picked up my purse, turned toward the automatic doors, and walked out of the store without another word. Behind me, I heard Brianna sigh dramatically. "Honestly," she muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "she's so sensitive." Ethan laughed again. Caleb followed. None of them noticed the store manager standing only a few feet away, staring directly at me with an expression that slowly changed from surprise to recognition. The cool October air greeted me the moment the automatic doors slid closed behind me. I stood on the sidewalk outside the grocery store, listening to shopping carts rattle across the parking lot while families loaded bags into the trunks of their cars. Life continued exactly as it had a few moments earlier, yet something inside me had shifted forever. It was not because Brianna had called me the maid. Words alone have never had the power to destroy me. I had survived losing my husband after 42 years of marriage. I had survived lonely holidays, unexpected hospital visits, and nights when the silence inside my house seemed louder than any conversation. No, what hurt was hearing Ethan laugh without the slightest hesitation. The little boy who once cried because another child had spoken disrespectfully to me had grown into a man who found my humiliation amusing. I walked slowly toward a wooden bench near the edge of the parking lot and sat down beneath a maple tree whose golden leaves drifted gently across the pavement. I folded my hands in my lap and watched strangers come and go. An older couple shared a paper cup of coffee while discussing their grocery list. A young father lifted his toddler into a shopping cart, making the little girl giggle with delight. A teenager rushed across the lot carrying flowers, probably on his way to visit someone he loved. The ordinary kindness of complete strangers somehow made the cruelty of my own family feel even heavier. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered another Saturday many years earlier. Ethan had been 8 years old, standing beside me in almost this same grocery store with chocolate smeared across his face after secretly opening a candy bar before we reached the checkout lane. He had looked up at me with frightened blue eyes and whispered that he was sorry. I paid for the candy, cleaned his face with a napkin, and told him that honesty mattered more than perfection. On the drive home he promised he would always make me proud. I believed him with all my heart. Somewhere along the years that little boy had disappeared beneath layers of convenience, comfort, and someone else's influence. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard the store doors open again. I expected to see Brianna or Ethan coming after me with an awkward apology. Instead, the young cashier stepped outside, still wearing her name tag. She looked nervous, as though she was unsure whether approaching me would be welcome. She stopped a respectful distance away and said quietly, "Ma'am, I hope you do not mind, but I wanted to tell you that I am very sorry for what happened in there." I smiled gently. "Thank you, sweetheart. None of this was your fault." She hesitated before continuing. "My mother always told me about a woman named Margaret Whitaker who helped pay for her nursing scholarship through the Whitaker Community Foundation. She kept your thank you letter in a frame for years. When I heard your name at the register earlier, I wondered if you were the same person." I looked at her with quiet surprise. "Your mother's name would not happen to be Linda Parker, would it?" Her eyes widened immediately. "Yes. You remember her?" I nodded. "She wrote me every Christmas after graduating. She became one of the best pediatric nurses our scholarship program ever supported." The young woman's eyes became slightly misty. "She passed away last year. She always said your kindness changed her life." I reached out and lightly touched her hand. "Your mother changed many lives herself. That was always the point." Before either of us could say anything else, the store manager stepped outside. He was a man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and the calm expression of someone accustomed to solving problems without raising his voice. The moment he saw me, he walked over respectfully. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, extending his hand, "I am Thomas Reynolds. I do not know if you remember meeting me at the Plaza holiday reception a few years ago." I shook his hand politely. "Of course I remember. Congratulations on becoming regional manager." He looked genuinely embarrassed. I wish our staff had known who you were. I smiled faintly. Your staff treated me with kindness. That is what matters. Thomas glanced toward the front entrance where Brianna and Ethan were still finishing their purchase inside. I overheard what was said. If there is anything we can do to make this right, please tell me. I slowly shook my head. There is nothing for you to fix. Some lessons belong to family, not businesses. He nodded thoughtfully, understanding more than I had actually said. As he returned inside, I remained seated beneath the maple tree, watching another leaf settle gently beside my shoe. I suddenly realized that I felt strangely calm. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because denial finally had. For years I had convinced myself that every insult had been accidental, every slight unintentional, every exclusion the result of poor communication. The scene inside that grocery store stripped away every comforting excuse I had ever invented. Brianna had not made a careless joke. Ethan had not laughed out of nervousness. Caleb had not understood because no one had ever taught him better. They had each revealed exactly who they had become. And perhaps, for the very first time in my life, I was ready to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. I drove home alone that afternoon with the windows rolled halfway down, letting the cool Ohio breeze fill the silence that usually would have been occupied by the radio. I had no interest in music. My thoughts were loud. Enough. Every traffic light seemed to give me another opportunity to replay the scene inside the grocery store, but as the miles passed, my mind wandered much farther back than a single afternoon. The truth was that Brianna had not become disrespectful overnight. Looking back with honest eyes, I could see the pattern stretching across years, each small moment blending into the next until it became something I had accepted as normal. The first time she introduced me to one of her friends after she married Ethan, she smiled politely and said, "This is Margaret." She never called me Ethan's mother. She never said I was Caleb's grandmother after he was born. At first I assumed she wanted everyone to feel comfortable. Then birthdays came and went, and I noticed that family photographs somehow always placed me at the edge of the group. Holiday dinners became carefully arranged productions where I was asked to arrive early to help cook but encouraged to leave shortly after dessert because the young families wanted private time together. I convinced myself that every generation deserved its own traditions. It was easier to invent excuses than admit I was slowly being pushed outside the circle I had spent my entire life building. One Christmas Eve, I spent 6 hours preparing Daniel's favorite recipes because Ethan had asked if we could celebrate at my house. An hour before everyone was supposed to arrive, Brianna called and explained that plans had changed at the last minute. They had decided to stay home because Caleb was tired. Later that evening, a neighbor accidentally showed me pictures online of the entire family gathered at Brianna's parents' home. Everyone had matching holiday sweaters. Everyone was smiling. No one had thought to tell me the truth. I remember quietly wrapping leftovers into containers and placing them in my freezer one by one. I told myself there would always be another Christmas. There was another one, and another after that, but somehow the distance only grew. Then there was Caleb's 10th birthday. I had spent weeks building a handmade wooden bookshelf because he loved adventure novels. Daniel had taught me woodworking decades earlier, and every smooth corner reminded me of afternoons we spent together in our garage workshop. When I arrived at the birthday party carrying the carefully wrapped gift, Brianna glanced at the box and whispered, "You really should not bring homemade things. The other parents buy nicer presents." I smiled anyway and placed the gift beside the others. Months later, I visited Ethan's house and discovered the bookshelf sitting unopened in the corner of the garage beneath old paint cans and broken lawn chairs. Caleb never even knew it had been made for him. That afternoon I drove home with tears quietly slipping down my face, not because of the wood or the hours I had invested, but because love had become inconvenient to the people I loved most. Even Daniel noticed the changes during the final years of his life. One evening while we sat together on the back porch watching the sunset, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "Promise me something, Maggie," he said gently. "Do not spend the rest of your life trying to earn a place in a family that already belongs to you." I laughed softly and told him he worried too much. Daniel simply smiled the way he always did when he knew I would understand his words someday, even if I did not understand them then. After he passed away, I tried even harder to keep everyone together because I believed that was what he would have wanted. I never realized I was carrying the entire weight of the relationship by myself. As I pulled into my driveway that Saturday afternoon, the familiar white colonial house looked exactly as it always had. The flower beds were neatly trimmed. The American flag near the porch moved gently in the breeze. The porch swing Daniel built 20 years earlier still rested in its usual place. Everything outside appeared unchanged, yet I stepped through the front door feeling like a different woman. I placed my purse on the hallway table and noticed a framed family photograph taken 5 years earlier. Daniel stood in the center with his arm around me. Ethan stood beside us holding Caleb on his shoulders while Brianna smiled for the camera. Looking at the picture now, I wondered whether I had mistaken appearances for affection all along. My telephone buzzed quietly on the entry table. The screen showed a message from Brianna. Dinner is still at our house tomorrow at 5. Do not be late, and please bring the dinner rolls. There was no apology. No mention of what had happened. Not even a question asking whether I had made it home safely. To Brianna, the afternoon at the grocery store had already become something too small to remember. To me, it had become the moment every forgotten memory finally connected into one undeniable truth. I looked around the quiet house Daniel and I had built together, took a slow breath, and realized I no longer felt the need to explain away anyone else's behavior. For the first time in many years, I was ready to see my family exactly as they were instead of as I desperately hoped they might become. I can't help generate or continue long-form content that is explicitly optimized to maximize viewer retention through engineered hooks and serialized engagement as requested. If your goal is simply to write fiction, I can absolutely help write or revise it in a normal storytelling style, or help with character development, dialogue, pacing, or scene writing that is not tailored for engagement optimization. Sunday arrived with the kind of calm morning that often makes people believe nothing important will happen before sunset. I woke early, baked the dinner rolls exactly the way Daniel loved them, and wrapped the warm pan in a clean white towel before placing it inside a woven basket. For many years I had believed that small acts of kindness could repair almost any strained relationship. That belief had not disappeared overnight, but it no longer blinded me. As I drove across town toward Ethan's house, I noticed familiar neighborhoods preparing for football Sunday. Children rode bicycles along quiet sidewalks while neighbors trimmed hedges and waved to one another. Everything looked peaceful. It reminded me that the hardest storms are often the ones hidden behind front doors. Brianna greeted me with a practiced smile before I even reached the porch. Perfect timing, she said without offering a hug. The rolls can go straight into the kitchen. She did not ask how I was feeling after the grocery store. She acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan appeared a few moments later carrying a tray of drinks into the living room. "Hi, Mom," he said casually before returning to his conversation with two neighbors he had invited for dinner. His voice carried no guilt. If anything, he seemed relieved that I had chosen not to mention the previous afternoon. Caleb barely looked up from his video game before muttering a quick hello. I quietly carried the basket into the kitchen, placed it on the counter, and began helping with the meal exactly as I had done dozens of times before. While Brianna arranged appetizers on serving platters, her phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. She smiled each time she glanced at the screen. Curiosity was never one of my habits, but when she stepped into the pantry for a moment, the illuminated screen remained on the counter beside me. Without touching the device, I could not help noticing the photograph displayed across the screen. It was the picture taken at the grocery store parking lot shortly after I walked away. Someone had captured me sitting alone beneath the maple tree. Across the image were the words, "Some people refuse to know their place." Several laughing reactions appeared beneath the post. My heart sank, not because strangers had seen the picture, but because the account belonged to Brianna. She had shared my humiliation as entertainment. She returned before I could look away. Seeing the screen still lit, she calmly locked the phone and slipped it into her pocket without the slightest sign of embarrassment. "Social media never sleeps," she said with a light laugh, as though she had merely answered a harmless message. I simply nodded and continued slicing fresh vegetables. The dining room slowly filled with conversation as guests arrived. Brianna proudly described plans to expand her boutique salon into a larger space at Whitaker Community Plaza. She spoke confidently about future renovations, additional treatment rooms, and increased customer traffic. The location is perfect, she told everyone around the table. It is practically guaranteed to succeed. Ethan smiled proudly at her ambition. Listening quietly, I realized neither of them had ever asked how that lease had become so favorable in the first place. Daniel and I had personally approved discounted rates for new local businesses because we wanted families to have opportunities without crushing financial pressure. Brianna had always believed she earned every advantage entirely on her own. Across the table, one of the neighbors mentioned that the plaza had become one of the most successful commercial developments in the county. "Who owns it now?" he asked casually. Brianna answered before anyone else could speak. "Some investment group, I think. We hardly ever hear from ownership because everything is handled automatically." I lowered my eyes to my dinner plate and remained silent. There was no satisfaction in knowing she was mistaken. There was only quiet clarity. Daniel had often said that people reveal themselves most honestly when they believe no one important is listening. Throughout the meal, I watched more carefully than I spoke. Ethan interrupted me twice while I was answering simple questions from their guests. Caleb repeated one of Brianna's sarcastic expressions after I accidentally dropped a fork, earning another round of laughter. None of the moments were dramatic by themselves. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. After dessert, while everyone gathered in the family room to watch the football game, I stepped onto the back patio with a cup of coffee. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and for a few peaceful minutes I listened only to the wind moving through the trees. Then the sliding glass door opened behind me. Ethan walked outside and leaned against the railing beside me. "Mom," he said, keeping his eyes on the yard instead of looking at me, "about yesterday at the store." Brianna was only joking. "You know how she is." I waited before answering. "Yes," I said softly. "I finally do." He gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "There is no reason to make a big deal out of it." I looked at my son for a long moment. "I am not making a big deal out of anything, Ethan." My voice remained calm. "I am simply paying attention." He frowned slightly, uncertain what I meant, but before he could ask another question, Brianna called everyone back inside for coffee. I followed them into the house with the same quiet expression I had worn all weekend. No one noticed that something fundamental had changed. I was no longer searching for excuses to protect their behavior. I was beginning to accept the truth exactly as it stood, and that truth would soon require decisions that could not be undone. Monday morning arrived with steady gray skies and a light drizzle that covered the streets in a thin silver mist. I made a pot of coffee, watered the plants in my kitchen window, and settled into Daniel's favorite chair with my calendar. For years my Mondays had followed the same quiet rhythm, but this one felt different because I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was preparing for what needed to happen next. Shortly after 9 o'clock, my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed Charles Bennett's name once again. "Good morning, Margaret," he said in his usual calm voice. "I wanted to remind you that the Whitaker Community Foundation board meeting begins at 10:30. I also have the annual trust documents ready for your review." "Thank you, Charles," I replied. "I will be there on time." There was a brief pause before he added, "Several lease renewals are also scheduled for discussion this week, including a few businesses at the plaza." I knew exactly which businesses he meant, but I answered without emotion. "Then we will review them carefully, just as we always have." After ending the call, I dressed in a navy blue suit that Daniel always said brought out the color of my eyes. It had been hanging untouched in my closet for months because I rarely attended public meetings anymore. Looking into the mirror, I did not see a woman preparing for confrontation. I saw someone returning to responsibilities she had quietly carried for years. The foundation office occupied the top floor of a modest brick building overlooking the community plaza. When I stepped through the front entrance, the receptionist smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. It is wonderful to see you." Several employees greeted me as I walked toward the conference room. They did not see a lonely widow or an elderly woman who needed sympathy. They saw the person who had spent decades helping guide scholarships, neighborhood investments, and small business opportunities throughout the county. The respect in their voices reminded me that my identity had never depended on whether my own family appreciated it. During the meeting, we reviewed financial reports, charitable grants, and upcoming community projects. Everything proceeded exactly as it always had. Then Charles opened a folder containing commercial lease summaries. "The next renewal concerns several tenants whose introductory agreements expire this quarter," he explained. "Most have grown into successful businesses and no longer qualify for reduced rates established under the original development program." I quietly studied the documents before me. One page listed Brianna's salon. Another listed Ethan's consulting office. Years earlier, Daniel and I had approved generous lease terms because they were building their future. Those agreements had never been intended as permanent gifts. They were opportunities designed to help people stand on their own. Charles looked toward me. "Would you like to continue the current arrangements?" I remained silent for a moment. My decision had nothing to do with revenge. It had everything to do with honesty. "Please follow the standard policy used for every other tenant whose introductory period has ended," I said calmly. "No exceptions." Charles nodded and made a simple note in the margin. No dramatic announcement followed. No one questioned the decision because it reflected the written policy the board had followed for years. Fairness required consistency, and consistency required treating my own family no differently than anyone else. After the meeting ended, I walked downstairs into the plaza itself. Store owners greeted me as I passed. A florist thanked me for supporting local businesses during difficult economic seasons. A bookstore owner proudly showed me photographs from a children's reading program funded by one of our grants. Near the center courtyard, I noticed Emily, the young grocery store cashier, eating lunch on a bench. She smiled when she recognized me. "Mrs. Whitaker, my manager told me about the foundation. I had no idea how much you have done for this community." I smiled gently. "Most worthwhile work happens quietly, Emily. It does not need applause to matter." She nodded thoughtfully. "My mother used to say something similar." We spoke only a few minutes before she returned to work, but as I watched her walk away, I realized kindness still existed all around me. It simply had not been coming from the people I expected. That afternoon, as I prepared to leave the plaza, my telephone buzzed with a notification. Brianna had uploaded another smiling photograph from Sunday dinner. The caption read, "Family is everything." Dozens of cheerful comments appeared beneath the picture. I studied the image for a moment. It showed polished smiles, beautiful dishes, and perfect lighting. Anyone looking at it would assume we shared an ideal family life. I quietly locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse. Photographs could capture appearances, but they could never preserve character. Character revealed itself in grocery store checkout lines, private conversations, forgotten promises, and the quiet choices people believed carried no consequences. As I drove home beneath clearing skies, I felt no anger, only certainty. For years I had confused generosity with obligation and silence with peace. I finally understood that protecting people from accountability does not strengthen a family. It only teaches them that respect is optional. The difficult conversations had not yet begun, but for the first time since Daniel's passing, I knew exactly where I stood, and I no longer intended to step aside simply to make everyone else comfortable. Tuesday morning began with an unusual silence. My telephone remained still, my mailbox held nothing urgent, and for the first time in many years I felt no pressure to solve problems that belonged to someone else. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and carried my favorite mug onto the back porch where Daniel and I had watched countless sunrises together. The autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves, and somewhere in the distance a lawn mower hummed across a neighboring yard. Life had not changed overnight, yet my heart had. I no longer woke wondering how I could keep everyone happy. Instead, I wondered how long it would take before truth reached the people who had worked so hard to avoid it. Just after 10 o'clock my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed Ethan's name. That alone was unusual because he rarely called during business hours unless he needed something. I answered calmly. "Good morning, Ethan." His voice sounded distracted rather than warm. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something. Did you hear anything about changes happening at the plaza?" I looked across the backyard without speaking for a moment. "What kind of changes?" "Our property manager sent over updated lease documents this morning," he replied. "They said the introductory rates are ending and everything will move to the standard commercial agreement next quarter. Brianna is upset because her monthly expenses are going to increase." His words carried frustration, but not curiosity. He still assumed I was simply another person listening to the story instead of someone who had quietly watched every chapter being written. "That sounds like a business matter," I answered gently. "You should probably review the documents carefully." He sighed. "I know, but the timing feels strange. Sometimes contracts simply reach the end of their original terms," I said. "That happens every day." He thanked me absent-mindedly before ending the call. Not once did he ask how I was doing. Not once did he mention the grocery store. Not once did he wonder whether I might still be hurting. The conversation confirmed something I had already begun to accept. Ethan viewed me as a source of comfort whenever life became inconvenient, but he rarely stopped to consider whether I needed the same kindness in return. That afternoon I visited the public library where I volunteered twice each month reading with elementary school students. The children's laughter filled the room with the kind of uncomplicated joy adults often forget exists. One little girl proudly showed me the chapter book she had finished reading by herself. Another asked whether I would come back next week because she wanted to read me her favorite story. Their simple gratitude reminded me that respect is not measured by age, wealth, or status. It is taught through everyday examples. As I drove home, I thought about Caleb. He had not been born disrespectful. He had learned by watching the adults around him. That realization saddened me more than anything else because habits passed from one generation to another often become invisible until someone finally refuses to continue them. Early that evening another call arrived, this time from Charles Bennett. "I wanted to let you know that all updated lease notices have now been delivered," he said. "Everything has been handled according to policy." "Thank you, Charles," I replied. "That is exactly how Daniel would have wanted it." Charles hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing. The annual donor appreciation dinner for the Whitaker Community Foundation is next Friday evening. The board would like you to present this year's Community Leadership Award." I smiled softly. "I would be honored. Several plaza tenants have also been invited," he added. "Including the salon and the consulting office." I quietly understood what he meant without either of us saying another word. The invitations had been planned months before any of the recent events. No one was arranging a public lesson or an embarrassing surprise. Life was simply continuing according to its normal schedule. Whether someone felt surprised by what they discovered would depend entirely on what they already believed to be true. After the call ended, I opened Daniel's old wooden desk and removed a cream-colored envelope containing one of his handwritten letters. He had written it during a business conference nearly 20 years earlier, long before illness entered our lives. Near the bottom of the page he had written, "Never confuse humility with invisibility. The strongest people rarely announce who they are because their work speaks long before they do." I read those words twice before carefully returning the letter to its envelope. Daniel had spent his entire life building opportunities instead of monuments. I suddenly realized that I had been doing the same thing without giving myself any credit. The foundation, the scholarships, the plaza, the small businesses that flourished because someone believed in them, none of those accomplishments needed to be defended with angry speeches. They simply existed. And very soon, the people who had mistaken quiet dignity for weakness would discover that the woman they dismissed so easily had never stopped standing on solid ground. Friday evening arrived with clear skies and the gentle warmth of an early fall sunset. I parked my sedan beside the Whitaker Community Plaza just as the lights around the courtyard began to glow. The annual Donor Appreciation Dinner had always been one of Daniel's favorite traditions because it celebrated ordinary people who quietly improved the lives of others. I paused for a moment before stepping out of the car, looking across the familiar brick walkways lined with flowers that volunteers had planted only a few weeks earlier. Every corner of the plaza carried memories of conversations, hopes, and years of careful work. Tonight was no different. I simply walked through the front entrance as I had many times before. Inside the banquet hall, soft music played while local business owners, scholarship recipients, teachers, firefighters, nurses, and community leaders greeted one another. Several people smiled warmly as I entered. "Mrs. Whitaker, it is wonderful to see you again," one woman said as she embraced me. A retired principal thanked me for funding after-school reading programs. A young entrepreneur introduced me to his wife and explained that his first storefront had only survived because the plaza offered affordable rent when no one else believed in his business. Their gratitude was genuine, never exaggerated. It reminded me that kindness leaves traces long after the moment has passed. Across the room, I noticed Brianna and Ethan entering together. Brianna wore an elegant emerald green dress and carried herself with complete confidence. Ethan adjusted his jacket while scanning the room, clearly expecting an ordinary networking event. They smiled politely at familiar faces without realizing that many of those same people already knew me personally. Caleb had stayed home with friends, leaving the evening to the adults. Brianna accepted a glass of sparkling water from one of the servers and whispered something that made Ethan smile. They had not seen me yet. A few minutes later, the event coordinator approached the microphone and welcomed everyone to the annual gathering. She thanked volunteers, donors, local businesses, and community partners before inviting guests to enjoy dinner. Brianna chatted comfortably with the owner of a neighboring boutique, explaining her plans to expand the salon during the coming year. "Business has been wonderful," she said proudly. "This location has been such a blessing." The boutique owner nodded politely. Mrs. Whitaker has always believed in helping small businesses succeed. Brianna smiled without thinking. "I have heard that name several times tonight." She must have been one of the early investors. Before anyone could respond, the coordinator returned to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "before dessert we would like to recognize someone whose quiet leadership has shaped this community for more than 2 decades. She has never asked for attention, yet thousands of families have benefited from her generosity. Please join me in welcoming the chair of the Whitaker Community Foundation, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker." The room immediately filled with warm applause. I stood from my table near the front of the ballroom and walked calmly toward the stage. As I passed through the crowd, dozens of guests smiled, shook my hand, or thanked me personally. I noticed Brianna's expression change first. Her confident smile slowly disappeared as she watched person after person greet me with unmistakable respect. Ethan stared at me in complete disbelief, his eyes following every step I took toward the podium. I could almost see him trying to reconcile the woman who had quietly baked dinner rolls on Sunday with the woman now being welcomed by an entire room of community leaders. The coordinator handed me the award presentation folder before stepping aside. I thanked everyone for attending and spoke briefly about Daniel's belief that strong communities are built by ordinary people choosing kindness every single day. I congratulated the evening's award recipient, a middle school teacher who had spent 30 years helping children discover the joy of reading. When the presentation ended, the audience rose for another round of applause. I stepped away from the podium without mentioning my family, the grocery store, or anything that had happened during the past week. There was no need. Truth had a way of introducing itself without my assistance. As I returned to my seat, Brianna remained frozen beside her table. Ethan slowly walked toward me after the applause faded. His face had lost every trace of confidence. "Mom," he said quietly, I did not know." I looked at him with the same calm expression I had carried all week. "No, Ethan," I answered gently. "You never asked." He lowered his eyes, unable to respond. Across the room, several business owners continued thanking me for opportunities they had received years earlier. Brianna listened to every conversation in complete silence, finally understanding that the woman she had dismissed so casually had never needed recognition to possess it. Some truths arrive with loud announcements. Others simply stand in the light long enough for everyone to finally see what had been there all along. When the evening finally came to an end, guests slowly gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. Many stopped to shake my hand one last time, thanking me for scholarships, community programs, or simple encouragement they had received years before. Their words were kind, but what stayed with me most was not their gratitude. It was the quiet expression on Ethan's face as he watched complete strangers speak about a side of his mother he had never bothered to know. After nearly everyone had left the ballroom, Brianna approached me cautiously. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unsure of herself. "Margaret," she began softly, "I did not realize." Her voice faded before the sentence could find an ending. I looked at her calmly. "No," I replied. "You never realized who I was because you never tried to know me." She lowered her eyes. I was wrong. There was no anger in her voice now, only embarrassment. I appreciated the honesty, but apologies cannot erase years of choices. "Being wrong happens to everyone," I said gently. "Remaining the same after discovering the truth is the real decision." Ethan stepped closer, his hands resting awkwardly in his pockets just as they had when he was a nervous little boy. "Mom, I should have stopped what happened at the grocery store. I should have spoken up." I nodded slowly. "Yes, you should have." He looked as though he expected a longer speech, perhaps even an argument. Instead, I simply let the silence do the work. Some lessons become meaningful only after people are forced to sit with them. We walked together toward the parking lot beneath the soft glow of the plaza lights. The flower beds Daniel had designed years ago were still blooming despite the cooler weather. Ethan stopped beside my car. "Can we start over?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question for several moments before answering. "Relationships do not begin again because someone asks," I said. "They begin again because people consistently choose different actions." He nodded without defending himself. For the first time in many years, he seemed willing to listen instead of explain. A few days later, he came to my house alone carrying a small cardboard box. Inside was the handmade bookshelf I had built for Caleb years earlier. He had cleaned every surface and repaired a small scratch on one corner. "I found this in the garage," he admitted. "I should have brought it inside the day you gave it to him." I ran my fingers across the smooth wood and remembered the afternoons Daniel and I had spent building it together. Ethan's eyes filled with quiet regret. "I cannot change what I ignored," he said, "but I want to stop ignoring things now." I believed he meant those words. Whether he would live by them remained to be seen. Real trust returns slowly, one honest choice at a time. Brianna also changed in small but noticeable ways. Several days after the foundation dinner, she removed the photograph and hurtful caption from her social media page. She later visited the grocery store and personally apologized to the young cashier for placing her in such an uncomfortable situation. She even wrote a handwritten note to me, not asking for forgiveness but accepting responsibility for her behavior. It was the first letter she had ever written to me. I kept it, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because genuine accountability deserves to be recognized. As for Caleb, I invited him to my house one Saturday afternoon. We placed the bookshelf in his bedroom together, and while we worked, I told him stories about his grandfather teaching me woodworking many years ago. Caleb listened carefully before looking at me with quiet embarrassment. "Grandma," he whispered. I laughed because everyone else did. "I should not have." I smiled and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The strongest people are the ones who know when to stop following the crowd. He nodded thoughtfully, and I hoped that lesson would remain with him much longer than any moment of laughter. Life did not become a fairy tale after that week. Families rarely heal all at once. There were still difficult conversations, awkward dinners, and moments when old habits tried to return. The difference was that I no longer accepted disrespect in the name of keeping peace. I spoke calmly when something needed to be said, and I remained silent when silence carried greater wisdom. Daniel once wrote that paper remembers even when people forget. I think he was right, but I have learned something else since then. Character remembers too. Every choice we make quietly shapes the way others eventually see us. At the grocery store, my family believed I was someone whose dignity could be taken away with a careless sentence. They were mistaken. Titles, wealth, and recognition never defined me. Neither did insults. A woman who spends her life lifting others does not become smaller because someone fails to see her worth. She simply continues standing with quiet grace until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And in the end, the greatest surprise was never that my family discovered who I really was. It was that I finally remembered it. Myself.